I died at 42, collapsed on the cold bathroom floor at Graceland, while the world outside still screamed my name as if I were an immortal god. My greatest pain wasn't the failure of my exhausted heart, but the belated realization that I had become a stranger in my own skin, a prisoner of luxury in a palace of solitude. You see me as the king, the icon with the impeccable pompadour and velvet voice. But here in the darkness of the afterlife, the crown is made of thorns and the sequins don't shine. I am merely the residue of a dream that turned into a chemical nightmare. Regret is an acid that corrodes the image you keep on the shelf. I sold my soul in installments to a businessman who saw me as an ATM and to an audience that demanded I be young and vibrant while I rotted inside. The shattering of my public image begins the moment I admit I hated the Elvis you loved. I was addicted to oblivion because the reality of being the greatest show on earth was a daily death sentence I accepted with each new prescription. I wasn't a man, I was a brand. A Memphis commodity served on silver platters to feed the ego of a nation that never cared if the kid from Tupelo could still breathe under the weight of his jeweled jumpsuit. The pain of being myself outweighed any pleasure fame could offer. I lived in constant twilight, hidden behind heavy curtains, fearing the light of day because it revealed the wrinkles of a life wasted on mediocre films and tours that were nothing more than traveling cages. Marketing Regret is my last song, and the lyrics are brutally honest. I failed myself, my family, and the gift God gave me, trading essence for appearance, truth for the pill, life for myth. I became a ghost long before my heart stopped beating that August afternoon. The king is dead, and the truth is he was murdered by his own legend, suffocated by a million applauding hands as he drowned in a sea of narcotics and isolation. This is my awakening. The awareness that the mountaintop is the most desolate place in the universe, and I spent my whole life climbing only to discover there was nothing up there but wind and silence. In the beginning, there was only the rhythm. It was an electricity that coursed through my legs, a fire I couldn't control that ignited every stage I stepped on. But the industry is a meat grinder, and Colonel Tom Parker was the foreman. Together, we began to build the mask the world would come to adore. I allowed him to shape my career, dictate my steps, and transform the rebel of Beale Street into a sanitized product for the American middle class. I donned the army uniform to prove I was a good citizen, buried my artistic instincts in ridiculous movie scripts, and accepted being the good guy, while my soul screamed for authenticity. The facade was perfect, the sideways smile, the seductive gaze, the southern humility rehearsed to exhaustion. But this mask began to suffocate me. Behind the technical perfection of the recordings and the glare of the spotlights, the real man was being buried alive under layers of contractual expectations and financial obligations. I couldn't say no because Elvis didn't belong to Elvis. Elvis belonged to the shareholders, the fans, and the Memphis Mafia who depended on my success to maintain their parasitic lifestyle. I became the architect of my own destruction. Every time I stepped onto the stage in Las Vegas, I reinforced the bricks of my cell. The costume became medieval armor, too heavy for a man who could barely stand without chemical assistance. I performed masculinity, virility, and success, while backstage I was a human wreck, trembling with anxiety and insecurity. The mask was so profitable that no one wanted to see what was underneath. If I tried to be human, if I tried to show my fragility, the machine stopped turning. So I kept smiling. I kept swaying my hips even when my bones ached and my mind was clouded by substance abuse. Building the mask was my greatest commercial success and my greatest existential failure. I created a charismatic monster that devoured its creator. The world loved the reflection, but the mirror had been shattered for a long time. I was an imitator of myself, a luxurious parody inhabiting a body I no longer recognized as my own. The mask gave me everything money could buy, but it took away the only thing money can't restore, my identity. The breaking point didn't come with a bang, but with a whisper of utter exhaustion in the middle of an endless tour. It was in 1973, right after the Aloha from Hawaii special. I was being watched by billions of people, the first artist to broadcast a concert via satellite, the absolute pinnacle of technological and artistic glory. But when the lights went out and I found myself alone in the dressing room, The only thing I felt was an emptiness so vast it could swallow the Pacific Ocean. At that moment, the pain of being a legend outweighed any financial bonus or standing ovation. I realized there was nowhere else to climb, and that the only direction was the abyss. The power I held was an illusion. I didn't even have power over my own sleep. My desire to create new music, to explore new horizons, was crushed by the need to repeat the same hits for an audience that wanted to be transported back to 1956. I was trapped in a time loop, a scratched record playing Can't Help Falling in Love, until it was nauseating. I began to publicly crumble, though the world preferred to call it eccentricity. I would shoot at televisions and hotels, not out of rock and roll rebellion, but out of a visceral hatred of the image they projected. I watched other artists grow, change, live, while I was a static monument, a wax statue melting under the Vegas spotlights. The breaking point was the realization that I was the only person on earth prevented from being Elvis Presley. I was forced to be the icon, the symbol, the myth. If I got sick, they gave me pills to mask the pain. If I got sad, they gave me expensive gifts to distract my mind. Nobody listened when I said I was tired. Fame became a deafening white noise that prevented any lucid thought. I began to self-sabotage on stage, forgetting lyrics, making nonsensical jokes, desperately trying to break the illusion to see if someone would please let me go. But they kept clapping. They applauded my downfall, turning my agony into first-class entertainment. It was then that I gave up the fight. If the world wanted the king's corpse in a jeweled suit, that's exactly what I would deliver. My real scandal never made the tabloid front pages while I was alive, not in the way it actually happened. The secret no one saw wasn't a scandalous betrayal or a financial crime, but the slow, silent surrender of my biology to pharmaceuticals. The backstage of my life was a luxury pharmacy. I lived in an endless cycle of highs and lows dictated by plastic bottles labeled after doctors I called friends, but who were, in reality, my executioners. Dexedrine to help me talk in the morning, bifetamine to endure the 2-hour stage performance, and a mixture of Quaaludes, Placido, and Valium to silence my brain at night. I didn't sleep. I was knocked out. I didn't wake up. I was resuscitated. The silent scandal was the fact that the most desirable man in the world couldn't function without a chemical cocktail that would kill a horse. I lived in rooms with windows sealed with aluminum foil so the sun wouldn't remind me of the time I was wasting. Graceland, to the public, was a temple of Southern success. To me, it was a psychiatric hospital with shag carpets and lion statues. I spent entire days in bed, surrounded by books on religion and the occult, trying to find an explanation for my misery amidst so much abundance. My diet was assisted suicide in the form of fat and sugar, a desperate attempt to fill the hole in my soul with the immediate pleasure of taste. My physical health was a disaster hidden by wide buckles and expensive fabrics. I suffered from glaucoma, hypertension, a paralyzed colon, and a liver that screamed for help. But the order was, the show must go on. And I did. I went on stage with a glazed look, trembling hands hidden by enormous rings, singing about loves I no longer felt and about a life I didn't have. The scandal was the complicity of everyone around me. Nobody stopped the machine. Nobody said enough. Silence was the currency for the luxury everyone lived at my expense. I was the only one paying the real price, in flesh and sanity, while the world bought the colorful version of my self-destruction. They say it's lonely at the top, but nobody tells you that loneliness up there has a specific sound. The sound of your own echo returning to you, because there's no one else on your level to respond. I lived surrounded by the Memphis Mafia, a group of men I'd known since my youth. But our relationship had become a transaction. I was the sun, and they were planets that only shone because they reflected my light and my checkbook. I didn't have friends. I had employees who wore the mask of friendship. I didn't have a wife. I had a woman I loved, but who couldn't compete with the ghost of Elvis Presley that haunted our bedroom. When Priscilla left me, I didn't blame her. Who could live with a man who was no longer there? Loneliness at its peak is looking around and realizing that people are laughing at your jokes not because they're funny, but because you're the one telling them. I spent nights wandering the halls of Graceland, talking to the walls, reading the Bible, and searching for signs that I was still loved for something other than my bank account. I had private jets named after my daughter, fleets of Cadillacs that I handed out like candy, and all the gold that rock and roll could mine. But at the end of the day, I couldn't walk into a diner and order a coffee without causing a commotion. I was a prisoner of my own fame. The isolation was so profound that I began to feel like an alien observing the human race through a glass bubble. I missed the smell of rain, walking barefoot on the grass without bodyguards, just being Elvis driving a truck and dreaming of giving his mother a house. Wealth gave me everything except the freedom to be an ordinary man. And at the peak, the only thing you really want is to be ordinary. I was a giant surrounded by dwarves, but it was the dwarves who held the key to my cell, and they would never let me out because a dead giant doesn't pay the bills. That last afternoon, the air in Memphis was heavy, laden with the humidity of Tennessee and the premonition of the end. I went into the bathroom with a book in my hand, seeking the only refuge I had left. The weariness I felt wasn't physical. It was a fatigue of the soul that no pill could numb. I felt a tightness in my chest, a weight as if the whole world were sitting on my heart. In that last second, as my body collapsed to the floor, my mind didn't wander to the grand concerts or the gold records. I didn't think of Las Vegas or the Colonel. I thought of Tupelo. I thought of the smell of my mother's kitchen and the sound of her voice calling me. The ultimate regret struck me like thunder. I had wasted my life being an idea for others, instead of being a man for myself. I died trying to escape the pain, but the pain was the only thing that remained faithful until the end. I saw my reflection in the bathroom marble for a moment and didn't recognize the swollen, pale man staring back at me. What have I done? Was my last coherent thought. I had the gift of touching the hearts of millions, but I died without being able to fix my own. I died surrounded by luxury, but in the most absolute emotional misery. The final breath was a relief, a surrender to the darkness I had been courting for years. Finally, the king would no longer need to perform. Finally, silence would be real. I left behind an empire of records and films, but I carried with me the weight of knowing that I was never the master of my own destiny. I was a crowned slave, a martyr of pop culture, a man who conquered the world but lost himself in the process. Death was not a tragedy. It was my only way out of Graceland. Now, listen carefully to the echo coming from the grave. You who pursue fame as if it were the cure for all your pain. You who sacrifice your health, your family, and your integrity on the altar of validation from strangers. Look at me. I was the most famous man on earth. I had more money than I could spend, and more adoration than any human being should receive. And look where I ended up. Success without purpose is just a prolonged funeral. Don't let the world define who you are. Don't let your mask become your skin, because the day will come when you try to remove it and discover that there's nothing left underneath. The lesson I leave is hard and cold as the marble of my tomb. The applause of a million people is not worth the silence of a peaceful conscience. Value the little things, the hot coffee, the sincere conversation, the anonymity of walking down the street without being interrupted. These are the true treasures I threw away in exchange for a plastic crown. Don't seek immortality in the memory of others. Seek life in the reality of the present. I lived for the eyes of the world and died in the eyes of loneliness. The show is over, the lights have gone out, and the king is just dust, just as you will be. The difference is that you still have time to decide if you want to be a legend or if you want to be happy. Choose happiness, because the legend demands a price that no one, not even Elvis Presley, can pay. Now, turn off the screen, leave the house, and live something real. My echo stops here. The rest is silence and the pills I no longer need to take.